coming up next, we do have a panel discussion, and it's chaired by Fran McKinney. He's head of digital learning at Hibernia College. Hibernia College is Ireland's only government accredited e-learning college. And Fran is an e-learning pioneer with a track record of innovation and commercial success in the US and Europe. Joining Fran and Daniel will be Dr. Mary Collins from the Royal College of Surgeons, Ireland, in their Institute of Leadership. Mary is a chartered psychologist who's been working in leadership development and talent management for over 15 years. And finally, our panel is joined by Adam Coleman. Adam is the CEO and founder of HR Locker, which he set up in 2014 to develop and implement best-in-class HR solutions. So I'll extend a big welcome to Fran and all the panelists.
Thank you, Tom. I just want to say thanks to Daniel again. It's a great presentation. I've listened to Daniel a couple of times now, and there is so much information packed in there. There's a lot to unpack and to tease out. Daniel mentioned the environmental singularity in his presentation, and in some ways his own situation reminds me of the predicament of climate scientists. He's working in an area of profound global implications. It's happening now. While it has extraordinary positive possibilities, it also has the potential to be highly disruptive. It's a bit scary for lots of people. But you know, for those of us who are in positions of influence in organizations or are leaders in organizations, we know we have to engage with this conversation now to ease a transition and make the transition better. So I want to tease out a couple of things in this Q&A. Please send us in your questions and we will try to get as many as I can to the panel. But let me start by turning to Mary and Adam first. Listening to Daniel's presentation, and in the context of your own work situations and research, what comes top of mind as important questions to ask when thinking about the future of learning and work in an era of AI? Big question. Let me start with you, Mary.
Great. Thank you, Fran. And thanks, Daniel. That was a really fascinating presentation and at times a little bit terrifying, to be honest. So really for me, what comes top of mind is when we consider the digitalization of our workplaces, I really believe the need to amplify the human skills comes to the fore. And the London Business School did a lot of research on this, and they talk about the importance of the creative and social intelligences. And when I consider, you know, the work I've been doing around the multi-generational workplace and looking at the younger generations in particular, you know, the need to foster leadership, empathy, creativity, coaching skills, all these human skills that we need. And, you know, one of the first studies that have been done on the centennials, so centennials born mid to late 90s, also known as Generation Z, what are they looking for to be fulfilled and productive in the workplace? The number one factor that came through in the research was supportive leadership. Number two was positive relationships at work. So again, these are back to the human skills, the emotional intelligence in the workplace. And just finally for me, I would say that that the need to build resilience. We know levels of depression and anxiety are higher and more common than ever, and I think they are also being amplified by the digitalization of life. So we need to have structures and supports in place in our workplaces. And I would suggest, particularly for the younger generations, to build their emotional and psychological resilience. So back to you, Fran.
Great. Thanks a lot, Mary. How about you, Adam? What came to mind listening to Daniel there?
Listen to Daniel. I think myself and Daniel would agree on an awful lot of stuff and probably butt heads on some other stuff as well, which most human beings should do. I think in terms of individuals, education is everything. And like Daniel has educated us on the way that AI is going, and more importantly, on the way that AI is being perceived and what's going to happen or what may happen as part of the greater good going forward. But I think, particularly in the line of, and I'm probably going to be the first one to mention this today, so I'm going to go COVID. The whole world has been turned upside down. The way of people working has changed. And I think the most important part that we need to deal with in terms of individuals is the education of them. And what I mean by the education is learning what they're saying, learning what they're feeling, learning what they want, and then more importantly, being able to establish an organization or a society that will allow them to voice it, and will create a sort of open, transparent meritocracy, be that in their organization or be that in society.
Yeah, okay, thanks Adam. A lot on putting people at the center here of this change, a lot on organization, training, education, and so on. Daniel, your own proposals around organization are fairly radical. You've gone fairly wide in terms of changes that you've made, just how decisions are taken and so on. How much of that speaks to your own personal approach? How much change do you think is actually required in organizational structures to manage the changes that we're going to experience?
A huge amount. So first of all, I'm completely unemployable, which means I'm not very good at being told what to do. So I want to work in an organization that gives me that freedom. But the inspiration for creating decentralized organizations actually came from the lack of ability to compete with some of the larger organizations. I won't go off on a rant, but it's now very difficult to out innovate organizations that have very, very deep pockets. And my suggestion now to companies is that rather than trying to build technology that competes with them, you need to try and tap into talent, the community, and you need to try and create economic models that feed that community. And over the past several decades, we've seen the open source community thrive, where people are contributing to innovations, and those innovations are free, but without a model to pay them. And what I'm trying to do is solve the problem of how do you bring all of the skills together in a decentralized organization, your accountants, your HR experts, your coders, your designers, your leaders, to be able to contribute to products in a decentralized way. And I think that we're probably still 5-8 years away from that model working.
Okay. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Daniel. Adam, you're pretty strong on organization, deliberate organizations, and so on. What are your own thoughts on required changes in organizations?
I think organizations only exist if they can attract talent, and I think Daniel said that. And I think the beginning of all of this is, whether it's a country, an organization, a planet, you need to have a good culture, because a good culture within an organization is going to attract the right people to that culture. You have to be very, very careful, because normally the culture starts with the CEO, the founder, and creating a good culture is very, very difficult. And particularly, as Daniel and Mary would have said, is that when you have large organizations, like we're a small organization, but we service about 40 different countries now, but mostly from Ireland and the UK at the present. And what I've set out doing in the early stages of HR Locker was, having come out of a big corporate, was to establish a culture that attracts the right people. And initially it started at attracting people locally, but with the idea of local attraction of good talent, that wasn't getting us anywhere to any great degree. So then we went completely remote. And then to change your organization from, we say, a static organization that's in one place to an organizational culture that can operate, that people can literally work anywhere in the world and work for that organization, be it HR Locker or be it whatever, is very difficult. A lot of the large organizations talk about it and it's lip service and you get their values on the wall. But you need more than the values on the wall. You need the values in the day-to-day communication in what you actually do in the organization. And it's not easy. If people think it's easy, everybody be doing it. And you do have ethical questions that people will ask you, and particularly with COVID, with people being at home. As I heard a great comment yesterday, and it was like, it's not about working from home, it's about parenting from work. And that whole scenario, that an organization and leaders in organizations have to be empathetic towards that whole scenario.
Yeah, no, and you raised the issue of ethics and ethical frameworks as well. I'm going to come back to that. It does seem to me to navigate this change, the role of leadership is going to be particularly important. And I also think a lot of leaders, given the scary nature of some of this, it's kind of easier to just be very busy and hope it's going to pass you by. Mary, you're in an Institute of Leadership. Any comments on the role of leaders right now in sort of getting your arms around this particular huge issue that's coming at us?
Yes, I mean, it's fascinating, Fran. I think what's happening to leadership at the moment, it's so dynamic. And I think a lot of leaders are really struggling with the transition, particularly during COVID, with most of our workplaces going virtual. And one of the big issues I see is the lack of flexibility and adaptability. And we really need to develop that flexible mindset. The other big challenge around leadership is creating a culture of connectedness whilst we are physically remote. And I think, Adam, just in our brief conversations, HR Locker are doing that really well. You know, you are connecting people. And we have to be really innovative around how can we ensure that people feel part of something. And it's back to this purpose and meaning piece that is so key. And we know the younger generations in particular are looking to their employers to give them that purpose and meaning in their lives. And that's a big responsibility. So I think being creative around making space for people and being empathetic and realizing that people have many different struggles at the moment with this virtual world. Some people, I know a lot of colleagues have been crying out to work from home for years, and this is manna from heaven. Other people, dare I say it, those with smallies in the house, it's torturous, particularly when you were headmistress of your school as well as trying to work from home. So I think we all have our own struggles, and the strong leaders and the successful leaders are the ones that can really show empathy, tune into their people, be flexible, and importantly, be optimistic, be constructive, be hopeful for the future.
Thanks, Mary. Daniel, what are you seeing around leadership? I'm going to jump into you. Particularly, we've seen lots of very public examples of the cost of bad leadership recently. So what are you seeing as well? And what other comments would you have?
It's really interesting. It's a great topic. I think, as Adam said, the strengths and also the weaknesses that I think we see in organizations typically stem from leadership. And the way that organizations are structured is that the higher you up, the more power, the more wealth, the more influence. You can mark your own homework you have. And I'm actually interested in how you can separate the powers in an organization. So in governments in the US and the UK, there's a separation of powers. There's the people that are acting within the laws, the people that create the laws, and the people that determine whether you've adhered to the laws. And in most organizations, actually, that's all those three things are held within the power of a small group of individuals. And I'd like to come up with a structure that decentralizes that. So that's the first comment. Second comment is that leadership isn't just sitting in the hierarchy. You have your formal networks, but you also have your informal networks. And what's interesting is now we can use data to separate them, to say this is the formal network, but actually we know that this person here is an influencer. They might not be high up in the hierarchy, but they're actually a really key influencer. So how do we empower those people with the right narrative and resources to allow them to influence the larger community? And just to talk about values, it's really interesting. If you Google most companies' values, the amount of money that they've invested in understanding their values and what they should be is massive. But most companies have the same values. It's like integrity and teamwork and innovation. It's the same across all of them. In fact, actually, Satalia is going to be using natural language processing, using AI, to try to extract values across all of these different companies to see if there are actually these common pillars. I don't think that prescribing these high-level values is the right solution. What we're trying to do is we're trying to create principles that allow for those values to emerge, whether teamwork to emerge, integrity to emerge. How do you create the right organizational structures at the foundation to allow for those things to emerge? Not just saying you have to operate with integrity or you have to be good at teamwork.
Which means, of course, your structures have to change.
Absolutely, yeah.
Adam, I know this is something again that you have views on.
My topic of choice. So what do you call them? And language is really, really complex. Back in the day when I worked in ESET Digifone, we created what was called a behavioral framework. And what it basically is a title, a definition. That was all agreed by what was senior management. And then what we did was we workshopped those through the organization. And we got everybody in the organization at the time, which was only a small organization at the time, but growing massively, rapidly. So we got them to figure out what good looks like under each one. And we used very awkward language, probably grammatically incorrect, but at the same time, it came from the essence of the people within the business. So that, for instance, yes, I would agree with Daniel on the basis that teamwork, flexibility, initiative and delivery, business integrity, all these things are really, really important. But they're more important if they're actually designed by the people within the business. It's the leaders in the business need to select the people that come into the organization. And once the values are established, they can values, principles, whatever you want to call them. And principles is probably one that I'm more comfortable with. And thank you, Daniel, for calling them principles. Because if you look at what's happened in the last number of years, the neurologists had said for years that the brain didn't evolve beyond the age of 32. And then about 10 years ago, they came out and they said, oh, sorry, we made a mistake. And then you had an array of organizational psychologists from Harvard, led by Robert Keegan, went out to prove what good looked like. And they examined down to 3 organizations, Decurion, Bridgewater Associates, and NextJump. And they spent a year living with them. And when they stopped living with them, they asked them the final question was, did you become a deliberate development organization where you put the people at the center of everything after you became successful, or was it the reason for your success? And in all 3 organizations, it was the reason for success, which is quite interesting because it puts the hands and the control into the individuals. But then if you have the values or the principles or the competencies and you use those to select the individuals, it sort of continues to roll on, and it creates a really, really good culture within an organization.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Adam. I want to turn to ethics. I'm always struck in Daniel's presentations by there's the hard technical, and then there's creativity, ethics, and so on. Ethics are obviously going to play a huge role in the emergence of AI systems and so on. Daniel talked about bias in algorithms, explainable algorithms. We've had trouble in the US most recently over bias in facial recognition algorithms and so on. Daniel, could you talk more about ethical frameworks and how day-to-day organizations may have to deal with ethical issues, or is this going to be dealt with by a few of the very powerful and so on? Just talk a little bit more about that.
It's a really good question. And actually, if you look at the Gartner hype cycle, AI governance is creeping up the hype cycle. So I think everybody's going to be talking about AI governance soon. As it happens, I've been thinking about AI governance for the past few years. First of all, I think it's important to separate 2 things. One is AI safety, and the other one is AI ethics. So AI safety is if I build a driverless car and the car mistakes a turning for, I don't know, something else and drives into it and kills somebody, that's a safety issue. The ethical issue is if I've got a choice between a kid and 2 adults and I can't stop and I have to kill one, then who do you kill? So I think it's important, first of all, to separate those 2 issues. But when thinking about AI governance, I think there are three key things to think about. And I'll be publishing an article about this soon. The first one is responsibility. Who is responsible for implementing AI systems? Is it the software developer? Is it the CEO? Is it the manager commissioning it? So we have to understand who is responsible for AI systems that go wrong, and it might be there are multiple stakeholders there. The other one is accessibility. Can we access the data, how decisions are being made, which then links to explainability? How are these systems making their decisions? How are they trained? Do they have bias? And the final one is, it slips my mind now. My brain doesn't work before 12. But the point is that there are these principles these governance principles that are different to traditional IT systems that we're having to now hold people accountable. And it's not until, unfortunately, things go wrong that we have cars driving off cliffs and killing people will we actually start to take this seriously, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you. Thanks, Daniel. Mary, in healthcare, you obviously face these issues, and these are part of your day-to-day considerations anyway. But in terms of, future of work and learning in an era of AI, ethical questions and what impact will have. How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a huge area in healthcare, obviously. And we've been doing a lot of work, Fran, in the Institute of Leadership around the whole notion of, that heroic leader at the top of the organization, that's redundant now. And we talk a lot about collective leadership or distributed leadership. And really, no matter where you are in the organization, you have the opportunity to show leadership qualities, so that leaders at all levels. And I think it's really key that we foster those leadership skills. Professor Nancy Cohen in Harvard has done brilliant work, and her seminal article is called "Real Leaders Are Forged in a Crisis." And I think particularly during this global pandemic, we are seeing people really step up, show grit. Others who maybe we had thought had leadership qualities are really struggling. So it is about fostering and encouraging and developing leaders at all levels in the organization.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Adam, any comments? Any comments on this?
I'm a massive fan of Socrates, and I'm not talking about the Brazilian Socrates. And if anyone has ever read The Apology or Plato's Republic or any of those type of things, Socrates went out to find out who the cleverest person in the world was. And he went and he questioned everybody. And he questioned the poets, and he found out they were fantastic at poetry, but not so good at other stuff. Likewise, the politicians and whatever. And at the very, very end, he realized that he was the cleverest. And if in most organizations, I think it's really, really important, particularly when you take ethics and culture into consideration, organizations have to really provide a safe place to fail. And ancient Greece didn't, and they killed Socrates, right? And they killed him because they saw him as arrogant. And the arrogance was that he felt he was the cleverest of all. But the reason he felt he was the cleverest of all is that he knew what he didn't know. And I think when people talk about ethics, and I steered away from it as much as I could in my early studies because I found it really complicated. So I've been wrestling with it for quite a while. I think it's above my pay grade, and I leave it to Daniel and to Mary to look at that. So hopefully this conference has provided me with a safe place to fail on that.
I'm not sure it's allowed to be above your pay grade, actually, Adam. But anyway, that's a different conversation. I have a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. I'm going to ask these quickly. I know Daniel has a question he'd like to put out to the audience in the conference. I'll remind him of it if he's forgotten. And then I'd like to put one last question to you guys. So quick round here. Audience question. What do the panelists think is the most overlooked or underrepresented value or principle in the companies of today? Adam, let's go back to you. Most overlooked or underrepresented value in companies of today?
Whoa. Trust and truth.
Okay, thank you. Daniel.
So I think in principles, and if you look at the Constitution and various other economic or political ideologies, you often hear these three things: equality, justice, and freedom. Or some derivative of those. But what is often forgotten is safety. Safety, it actually takes away your freedoms and things like that. And I think we need to call out explicitly safety within our organizations. How do you create psychologically safe organizations?
Okay, thank you. Mary?
Yep, I would absolutely concur. I was thinking the importance of psychological safety, that I think is often very undervalued. And I'd link with that the importance of diversity. And diversity in every sense of the word. So diversity and psychological safety are just so key, both of those.
Cool, that's great. Thanks, Mary. One for you, Daniel. Well, big one, but let's see. How do we keep bias out of AI systems? A human is programming the code. How do we consider people of all abilities, creeds, etc., and make AI less biased than humans?
It's a big question. So the first thing is that there are two types of system we need to think about here. One is machine learning, which is learning from data and trying to generalize the world. So I give a machine pictures of apples and oranges, and I teach it to distinguish between apples and oranges, but sometimes it'll get it wrong. I'll show it an orangey apple, and depending on the data that I've given it, it will make a mistake. So actually, there are two big areas that cause bias. One is the data that you're giving these systems, and the second one is the objective function that you're defining. So if I build a hiring system, and I say I'm looking for a certain tone in the voice, or I'm looking for people to smile during the interview process for them to go into the next stage, I'm now putting some bias in there. I'm saying that people that smile are the ones that are successful. So I think it's important to say that there are two places to focus on: data and the objective function. All systems are going to be biased, and the challenge is, how do you A/B test that against a human to make sure that that it's not worse than a human being? But I think that if it's better than a human being, we should implement it. The problem with that is that those people that are commissioning those systems are the ones that then become vulnerable. So if I'm a CEO and say, we're putting this system in place, we know it's better than a human being, but then it gets challenged, maybe it's me that's going to be accountable for that. And that might be a barrier or a blocker for innovation.
Actually, related to that is the questions just come in around hiring psychologists, educators, sociologists, in addition to software engineers and so on in companies. What do you do, and what are you seeing other companies do in this regard, other AI companies do in this regard?
I think, yeah, we all hire organizational psychologists, philosophers. So it's really great, Adam, that you've spoken about Socrates. Big fan of him as well. So yeah, we try to make sure that everything. So let me give you an example. We don't just build these structures for the sake of technology. I think that this is true, but apparently 60% of the population have attachment disorders, which means that we are dysfunctional at forming, maintaining stable relationships because of our upbringing as an infant. And this is the psychological theory that we now need to bring into organizations and say, if 60% of these people are dysfunctional, they feel threatened, irrational, all that kind of stuff because of events that happen within organizations, how do we build structures that still keep them feeling safe? And we wouldn't know that just by looking at it from a technological lens. You need to bring in psychologists and sociologists to help make sure that you're having a holistic approach. And
you're seeing other AI companies do this?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I have one last question for all of you. We're just about out of time right now. Different kind of a question. The English film critic Mark Kermode has a saying. He says, everything is going to be all right in the end. If it isn't all right, it isn't the end. And it raises questions of pessimism and optimism in the light of changes that AI is going to bring. So I wanted to ask the three of you, where are you in the scale of pessimism to optimism around society, organizations, the globe navigating this massive change which is on its way? Adam, I'm going to start with you. Sorry about that.
I think, personally, there's goodness in the majority of humans. And I think, AI and automation and whatever will automate the domain. It'll allow people to get to a better place. And we all know about Maslow's hierarchical needs. And unfortunately, the world hasn't got off the first piece where air and water and food and whatever is available to everybody. I am not personally optimistic with the current leaders in the world. I certainly wouldn't want to be any of them. I'm not even sure whether I could do a better job than them. But I know I couldn't do a worse job than them. But all in all, I think I'm optimistic, because I think inside the majority of people, outside the very, very small amount, is goodness. And I think as long as we keep amplifying that goodness, and we get those people who are coming from a good place, the likes of the Marys, the Daniels, and the Frans of this world and whatever, I think, and as long as we keep promoting the goodness and not pushing it down, I think we're in for an optimistic place. We'll go to an optimistic place.
Thank you, Adam. Mary, where are you?
Yes, eternally optimistic. And I think AI has the potential, is actually transforming our work to make our work so much more interesting, and getting rid of a lot of the work we didn't want to do anyway. So for me, and I'm really heartened, Daniel, to hear you talk about the role of psychology in the workplace. I'm biased, of course, but to talk about that, and also to have philosophers around the table. And for me, that's key in this. In any of the strategic planning around this, we need that cognitive diversity. So I think the more great minds we can get around the table, the better.
Great, thanks, Mary. And Daniel, the last word.
Yeah, sorry. So I think if we're able to automate as much as possible our nutrition, healthcare, if we're able to free more and more people up around the globe, I think that, as Adam said, humans have an innate desire to be good, to be able to contribute positively to the human race. We are going to face lots of problems over the coming decades. And if we can tap into the creative capacity of humanity, allowing them to be philanthropists and entrepreneurs, they're the people that are going to solve these problems. So that's the first part. The second part is that we need to be holding leadership accountable, both in terms of how we consume the stuff that we consume, and also what we contribute to. And if we're more conscious about that, then we can steer humanity to a positive direction.
Great, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Daniel. Very thoughtful conversation. And Daniel, thank you for your work. It's really important. And with that, I'll hand back to Tom.